What I make of it is it's absolutely unprecedented and extraordinary stuff. All this stuff from Stephen Miller about, what right does Denmark have to Greenland is just deflecting and trying to change the subject, because there's no question about Danish sovereignty over Greenland, although Greenland may have long-term aspirations to some form of independence. But it's still very difficult for someone with a background of 40-odd years in diplomacy to imagine how we're in a state where one NATO country, effectively the leader of NATO, is effectively threatening military action against another NATO country, against an ally, over its wish to basically grab a piece of that country's territory.
Britain and France have committed to deploying troops to Ukraine in the event of a peace deal. They've signed a declaration of intent after a meeting in Paris of 35 countries in the so-called Coalition of the Willing. Crucially, the US will agree to support the force if it is attacked, according to a draft statement. Sir Keir Starmer set out the plan for military hubs across Ukraine.
It paves the way for the legal framework under which British, French and partner forces could operate on Ukrainian soil, securing Ukraine's skies and seas and regenerating Ukraine's armed forces for the future. We discussed these issues in detail today, and so I can say that following a ceasefire, the UK and France will establish military hubs across Ukraine and build protected facilities for weapons and military equipment to support Ukraine's defensive needs.
Well, Sir Keir said a peace deal could only be agreed if Russia makes compromises, and he warned that President Putin is not showing that he's ready for peace. The US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, who was there at the talks, said President Trump strongly stands behind the security arrangements.
We think we're largely finished with security protocols, which are important so that the people of Ukraine know that when this ends, it ends forever. But we also think, critically, that we are very, very close to finishing up as robust a prosperity agreement as any country has ever seen coming out of conflicts like this. It will aspirationally mean large possibilities for the Ukrainian people.
Well, in the last hour, the White House has made another statement on Greenland, saying that President Trump and his team are discussing a range of methods for acquiring Greenland, adding that this is a national security priority of the United States and that military force would always be an option at Trump's disposal. Let's talk to Lord Darroch, a former British ambassador to the US and a former national security advisor. Good evening to you, Lord Darroch.
Evening, Carol.
Well, my goodness, so much to talk about. Let me start with that agreement, the words we heard there from the Prime Minister, that Britain and France are now committed to deploying troops to Ukraine in the event of a peace deal, setting up those military hubs. I mean, what do you make of that plan?
This has been under negotiation for a while, and agreement is what you would have expected after all of the work that's gone into it. It's right that the UK and France should be effectively leading on this as the two major military powers in Europe. And from the sound of it, it's all quite well worked out and worked through. But, Carol, as has just been said, I think, by the Prime Minister, there is no evidence yet that Putin is prepared to make any concessions at all to Ukraine to achieve a peace deal. I mean, his position is absolutely maximalist and not a basis, I think, for a deal to be reached. So we may well still be a long way from any point at which any such force might be deployed.
Yeah, because the key point here is that no one is talking about the British, French or any other forces going in and taking on the Russian forces. This is after a peace deal, which is still a long way off. But the crucial thing in all of this is those US security guarantees, isn't it?
It is, and it was always a European demand that the Americans should be behind this reassurance force in some way. However, all I've heard so far is the words US support. And what exactly is the nature of that support is a rather important question. I mean, is it the possibility of, offensive, US military air support if the Russians were to cross any lines, or what exactly does it amount to? So it'll be important to know those details. Much more important for the Ministry of Defence and for the British and French governments, of course, than for me. But this is kind of a crucial point. Exactly what is that support?
And of course, while you've got the British and French and other leaders saying that they're relying on US support on this, we've got the White House once again ramping up the pressure over Greenland. I mean, let's just first of all have a reminder of what the US Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller has said when he was speaking about this to CNN.
The real question is, by what right does Denmark assert control over Greenland? What is the basis of their territorial claim? What is their basis of having Greenland as a colony of Denmark? The United States is the power of NATO. For the United States to secure the Arctic region, to protect and defend NATO and NATO interests, obviously Greenland should be part of the United States. And so that's a conversation that we're going to have. There's no need to even think or talk about this in the context that you're asking of a military operation. Nobody's going to fight the United States militarily over the future of Greenland.
And we've now had that statement essentially doubling down on US claims on Greenland, saying that that President Trump and his team are discussing a range of methods, that it's a national security priority, and that the use of military force would always be an option. I mean, what do you make of that?
What I make of it is it's absolutely unprecedented and extraordinary stuff. All this stuff from Stephen Miller about, what right does Denmark have to Greenland is just deflecting and trying to change the subject, because there's no question about Danish sovereignty over Greenland, although Greenland may have long-term aspirations to some form of independence. But it's still very difficult for someone with a background of 40-odd years in diplomacy to imagine how we're in a state where one NATO country, effectively the leader of NATO, is effectively threatening military action against another NATO country, against an ally, over its wish to basically grab a piece of that country's territory. I mean, it's really, if it weren't happening, you simply wouldn't believe that this were possible. So these are unprecedented times. Look, the only thing that I can say is potentially a little bit hopeful about this, because what we're talking about, if this was ever to happen, is I think the collapse, the destruction of NATO. Is Trump is a ruthless businessman and negotiates through threat and intimidation and bluster. And all of this stuff about, of course the military option is on the table, may be just a way of trying to intimidate and bully Denmark into making some concessions and making an offer. I think it's absolutely fair for the Americans to say that Greenland is strategically very important in these troubled times, but they already got a military force on Greenland territory, and I think they could put as many American soldiers onto Greenland if they asked permission from Denmark as they wanted. So they can deploy everything they want there without actually taking it over. So,
and we had this statement, didn't we, earlier? And we had this statement earlier in the day, sorry to interrupt you, from Britain, France, other European leaders utterly rejecting US claims on Greenland, saying that this is a matter for the people of Greenland and of Denmark, because Greenland is part of the Kingdom of Denmark, to decide. But I mean, if the US were to do this, were to try somehow by force to seize Greenland, do you think that, as we heard the warnings before, and as you've referred to, that this would be the end of NATO because it would pit one NATO member against another?
Yeah, it's hard to see for me how NATO could survive if this had actually happened, because you would have European members of NATO, plus I suspect Canada, thinking about what they need to do to what would be another illegal under international law action by the United States, but this time not against a corrupt dictatorship. This time against a democratically elected NATO ally, and that's just it's literally inconceivable. Which makes me, maybe it's a forlorn hope. Makes you just wonder if this isn't just a negotiating tactic to try and squeeze some more concessions out of Denmark. Also, the timeline of sometime in the next 3 years gives you quite a long time for negotiating some way forward that could involve, more American troops on Greenland, more American military installations or whatever. But, these are extraordinary times, and you can't really rule anything out. And the fact that European leaders have felt motivated to make this statement shows how much concern there is around Europe.
Lord Darroch, former British ambassador to the US, former national security advisor, really good to have you with us. Thank you so much.